who are we? CCLA difference, what? Difference makers.
Well, I have to share first. My name is Dennis Regus. I'm from Riverside County Office of Ed, about 6 hours driving south of here. And I know for a fact 2 of my colleagues are online back in our office. And I'll share with you just because it's kind of funny. I know they're watching us on the super large screen. So my face is like gargantuan right now in an office space back there. And I told them, I'm all, that's awesome because I'm going to be thinking about that the entire time I'm talking, right? So there's the nice cameras back there and everything like that. So thank you all. Thank you guys for coming. And we're going to do a lot of stuff kind of interactively and get into some math routines and things. But I first wanted to share my contact information is there. A lot of the stuff we're going to do, you might need to access a couple of documents digitally if you want, but they'll also be up on the screen. So I wanted to also just give a shout out to my colleagues that were not able to come. The Andrea Barron, Deanna Sehan, Susie Jaggers from Riverside County, they helped to put a lot of these slides together with me, or I just lifted them from things we'd done together and whatnot. So our learning intentions and success criteria for today, hopefully you'll be able to speak to at least one routine that will increase discourse for language learners in your classrooms. Hopefully you'll be able to ask questions about how, or be asking yourselves questions about how this applies to your current reality, and also describing at least one idea to better engage multilingual learners in mathematics. So I know there's only 4 of us here, and if the people in the on Zoom, if you can drop this in the chat, I'm just curious where everybody's from and your role. So if they can drop it in the chat and we can read those off, but if you don't mind letting us know, where are you from? Okay. I do. Yep.
Currently, I teach 4th grade, but I've also taught in the middle school, and I will most likely be teaching middle school next year.
Okay. So mostly middle school math, also taught 4th grade, and you're from the Red Bluff area north of Chico.
Yeah.
All right. Yes. Right on. Hi, Mackenzie. Abe?
Abe Goldman. I am a TOSA at Union School District, San Jose. It's my first year in that role. And 9 years previous, I was a 7th grade math teacher at Union.
Okay. So current TOSA, former middle school 7th grade math teacher. Right on. That's where I lived too prior to moving out of the classroom. I was a 7th and 8th grade math teacher primarily. Stacy? Oh.
Here with all folks, but other than math teacher, I'm ready to learn.
All right. Actually, I know this young lady right here, Dr. Princess Solomon. She's the director, our director from our instructional services unit. I'll introduce her while she's getting settled. So thank you all for joining us. And one of the things I wanted to start out with, just kind of as an opener, just to get us chatting with one another, is this is, I don't know why this is one of my favorite routines, but or things to do with people. 2 truths and a lie. So we're going to start out with mine up here. So I'll let you take a guess at which one of those is the lie. That I nailed my thumb to a 2x6. I've completed over 100 open water dives, and I've hiked 200 plus miles of the Appalachian Trail. So I'm curious, knowing little or more, because they both work with me, about me, what do you think might be the lie up there? The diving? Okay. The diving? Okay. All right. That, right? I think that the thumb is true. And I think it's like there's so much specificity that it seems more like a truth. Because it is. I shot a 16 penny nail through my thumb into a 2x6. Prior to teaching, I was I worked in construction. That was the first of 3 accidents that sent me back to getting my credential. The second was I nearly cut off my big toe with a skill saw. when your colleagues tell you to pin the guard back because it's more efficient, don't do that. It's a bad idea. That guard's there for a reason on a skill saw. And then I have actually completed over 100 open water dives. But I've not hiked 200 plus miles on the Appalachian Trail. It's actually, I've done that on the Pacific Crest Trail on this side of the country. I do. And so I have done it, but on this end of the country. So so what I wanted to do then is give each of you just a moment to think of two truths and a lie with your partner. And then while you're thinking about that, I want to go backwards real quickly and ask, who's on the chat? I asked them to share out who they were. So who's there? Awesome. Welcome, Raquel.
I'm on the chat. Did you want me to share with the microphone? Michelle?
Right on. Okay. Oh. Okay. Well, welcome, Michelle, and welcome to my colleagues in Riverside. All right, so I'm going to give you about 2 or 3 minutes. Just take turns with your partner, two truths and a lie, and then we'll come back together. And if you'd like to, the people online or virtually, you can drop it in the chat for one person. I know there's a group. So if you want to drop it into the chat for one person, and the other people on Zoom could guess. All right, if you can finish up your conversations, and we'll come back together. So part of this was intentional. It's not just that I like the routine, but it also requires, we were talking about back here, potentially the specificity of language. And I'm going to use the example you said is about like I had hit a hole in one, right? Like I could state that for sure, but without specifying where I did that, it could be easily a truth that I've hit a hole in one. Or it could be a truth that it was on a real golf course, but I could easily be like, yeah, I did because I've done that on a miniature golf course, right? But if I leave this specific part off, the language is important. So as we move into some of the routines and things we're going to talk about, I wanted to just give you some background. There's been probably, I can think of two or three major things that have led me down this road of being very conscious and kind of purposeful around working with English learners and multilingual learners. The first was, I can remember my second year of teaching, there was a large 3-day professional development for teaching mathematics to English learners that I went to, that the district put on. And the woman that was brought in to do the presenting spent the first 2.5 hours presenting in Spanish. Which was for me, I took a couple of years in high school, but it was very much an experience that opened my eyes to what English learners in my classroom might be going through, depending upon at their time. This was when we talked about SELT levels and things like that. And at the time, I was also teaching newcomers math, and they knew very little, so I learned a lot of math for teaching Spanish. No, sorry, Spanish for teaching math. At the time, and they helped me with that, and as much as I helped them with the mathematics. So that was a very eye-opening experience for me. And then fast forwarding about 10 years into the future, I started getting my master's, and my first class in my master's program required me to shadow an English learner for 2 days. And I shadowed the English learner in the school I was teaching in, a middle school, and two things were, I guess, eye-opening to me. One, the student didn't speak for 2 straight days in any one of his 6 classes each day. The second thing, kind of ironically, was I'm surprised middle school students don't revolt, because I was so bored as an adult that I'm like, well, there's 700 of you, and you could take us pretty easily if you wanted to. Because it was very, very, and this was 15 years ago, so maybe it was a little more teacher-driven instruction than now. But it's just something that's helped to make me more passionate and compassionate around English learners. The third thing, which is really kind of the crux of today, is I recognize how important it is to actually be able to speak if you're trying to learn a language with specific academic terms like mathematics. You have to be able to use that language. And it was really driven home to me because I spent the last 2.5 years on Duolingo trying to learn Spanish. And I'm really good if I can hear people talking it, like speaking it. I can understand it pretty well. I'm really good at reading it, but I still can't speak it at all because in 2.5 years, I had very few people to practice with. And so that component of actually using the language is massively important if we're going to have an impact on our English learners. So with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the other grounding ideas for today's presentation. First, there's these 2 shifts in focus. We want to kind of move away from or think about what does it look like for us if we move away from teaching kind of this idea of I teach standards and content so kids can pass tests and get good grades, to I love this idea. My colleague who is online, Andrea Barron, always talks about this, the idea that we teach humans, right? And that they deserve a positive math identity. Like we deserve to create a world 15 to 20 years from now where there are far fewer adults talking about, I'm not a math person. You know, that doesn't mean they all have to love and master calculus and everything above and beyond that, but recognizing the usefulness and the utility of mathematics in their daily lives and that it's not something to be scared of. So with that, there's also, we use this a lot in our work at RCOE. We talk about, this is actually from Ed Code in California, that each child is a unique person with unique needs, and the purpose of the education system of this state is to enable each child to develop all of his or her own potential, right? I think the Crazy thing for me is I probably never read that until like 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And had somebody read that statement to me and asked me where it came from, I think the last place I would have placed it is ed code, right? Because that is not how I envision our system. I believe that is an insanely wonderful and lofty goal that we should continue to strive for, but it's not always how I envision our system working for our students. So with that, our English Learner Roadmap also details out that English learners fully and meaningfully access and participate in 21st century education from childhood to 12th grade, resulting in their attaining high levels of English proficiency, mastery of grade level standards, and opportunities to develop proficiency in multiple languages. Again, one of the things that sticks out to me from this is this idea of gaining proficiency in multiple languages. Because I think often in our system that primary language is let go of in favor of learning English. And we don't honor the asset they bring to the classroom. That is their primary language. So, and ways we can do that, we'll talk about throughout the presentation today. So, a couple other ideas that we wanted to share. Identities that people claim or refute or are assigned by others are powerful factors in obtaining access to classroom discourse. So what this is talking about is, as we think about the routines today, sometimes we have to acknowledge that the structures in our classrooms or in our schools or in our districts actually convey certain benefits or negatives to our students. You know, that if we only, like it says here, if we only position experts and highly knowledgeable students as being worthy of sharing their ideas in class, then we send an inadvertent message to our less proficient or maybe less articulate students that their voice doesn't matter as much. And we have to recognize, we need to recognize that. So this gets us to the TRUE framework. Are any of you familiar with the TRUE framework? Yeah, awesome. Sweet. So TRUE is the teaching for robust understanding. There's 5 dimensions to it up here, and the first column says the mathematics, but it actually is applicable to any content area. And this is actually the document we're going to use to reflect in our small groups today. And as we go through the different routines, I'm going to ask you to kind of reflect on which one of these dimensions you see reflected in what we did. And there is a link to it in the document you have as well for the people in Zoom. And so as we do this, we'll have some opportunities to talk in more detail about these dimensions. But lately, we've also been sharing this because it seems very applicable to classroom instruction. This did not come directly out of the materials for TRUE that were developed, I believe, at UC Berkeley and University of Nottingham. But this actually was developed by a group of administrators and teachers in one of our school districts in Riverside County. They took TRUE and they wanted to make something that seemed more easily understandable by teachers on what it looked like on a day-to-day basis in their classroom. And so they created this continuum where inside of a math classroom and during math instruction and teaching and learning, you should see less of the things on the left-hand side and more of the things on the right-hand side. And they were very intentional about less of and more of. So it's not that you should never see worksheets, you know, or you should never see hand raising. You should just see less of that in a classroom that is centered around students and student voice and student agency. And so it's just another way to think about TRUE and think about what are those shifts we want to see in our classrooms for the benefit of all of our students, including our multilingual learners. All right, so there's a few different things that we've talked about that I've kind of laying a foundation for some of our discussions. I'd like to give you 2 minutes to just either quietly reflect or turn to a neighbor. What systemic structures do you see in your own system that are present currently that might be inadvertent roadblocks to the success of multilingual learners? So in your own reality, what structures do you see in place that might be roadblocks to their success? So I'll give you about 2 minutes just to chat with your neighbor, and then we'll share a couple things out. On Zoom, you can type it into the chat when you're ready. Take that off as the top of the list when the list is 20 minutes long.
In my company, and so I'm learning. Okay, for sure, what I need to learn for all 30 students versus what I need to do for 6. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, I would like want to do that, but I don't know how we do that.
Shared diversity, right? The number of languages that we have shown for our school. So even if you so like I had my Spanish class students that sort of bridge that. Now you have I don't know, so then it's like, oh, I have a language for that. Like all of these strategies. And you still have that word.
That's crazy.
A bunch of different dialects, there's, Chinese, there's Indian, and there's Hebrew, and I mean, it was 20 different languages, and not one of them was Spanish. And then you go to a different, there's 2 middle schools. And the other middle school is a mile away. Yeah, the females are like the majority are Spanish, it's totally different world.
And that's one of those systemic structures. If there's somebody who's maybe who has some bias and believe that if your English learning is Spanish,
Right.
right? Like that's there's a whole swath of students that are not going to be given the consideration, maybe.
Or even, I think more like, put a finer point on it, like if you already speak Spanish, then you have these. And if you're, so it's
Right. All right, if we can come back together. I'm going to ask real quickly, is there anybody that shared out on Zoom? What'd they say? So understanding of the ELD standards, grading practices, and just-in-time intentional scaffolds. Okay. Were there any other systemic structures that you all talked about? I know there were, but I'm going to give you this because it'll be easier for them to hear online.
So we talked about curriculum, how the curriculum, even if you have an ELA, ELD component, it's not fully where it's got the scaffolds and the supports there for the teachers. Like you have to go somewhere else in order to get it. And then you also have to go somewhere else for any of the other content areas where we could put some of those tools right there with it, especially for the top 2 languages. I mean, if you did it for the top 5 languages, right? Just helping it so that it could be more accessible.
Absolutely. Anybody else? Yeah.
Them mentioning the grading practices made me think homework is a really good, probably inequitable for a lot of different students, but especially those who don't speak the language. They're maybe not going to be able to get the help at home that some of the other students are. And then if that is a graded component, I mean, you're just setting them up for either a lot of extra work or just to fail.
It's inevitably, I like not inevitably, but whenever somebody mentions homework, it's like I can't help but like homework has to be something kids can do on their own if you're gonna assign it. It has to be so obviously review that they're not going to need anyone's help with it, right? And of course, you're not going to find a topic that's true for all 100% of your students, but you know, right, or not grade it. There's so many other ways to make it equitable, right? But I also recognize, like, I talk to students who tell me, well, my teachers say they don't assign homework, but whatever we don't finish in class is homework. I'm like, well, that's like the worst kind of homework. Because if I didn't finish it in class, there's a good chance it's because I didn't understand it. And now I got to go home with potentially no help to finish it. Like that just, yeah. And it's like, it's one of those things where I get the well-meaning intention, but it's like a big swing and a miss, you know, unfortunately. So anything else that came up? Yeah. Okay.
We talked about not having a choice, like kids don't have a choice in what they're learning. And so everybody's learning the same thing all at the same time. And it's like not realistic. That's not, the levels of everybody, they don't have any voice or any kind of choice of where they want or like what they want to learn. And so if then there's like no real connection to what they're learning. And we kind of talked about like language in general and how if you don't like I get a lot of ELs in my class all the time, so being able to make the connections of what actually happens in their home versus what's in the book. And so like being able to just switch a little bit of that could definitely change their interest level and how much they participate.
Absolutely, making those problems and the context more relevant to students. You know, listening to something the other day where they'd interviewed students about why they didn't engage with this particular problem. On that was about like clowns in a. It wasn't clowns in a car, but one of the kids was just like, "I'm never going to work in a circus. Why do I care?" Like they just made this weird connection, right? That and it wasn't relevant to their. But the point being, it wasn't relevant to their lives, so it was less engaging, right? And so one of the things that comes to my mind when I think about these systemic structures is sometimes we have practices in place that are well-meaning, but are a slight miss. And what I mean by that as an example is before I left the classroom, the school I was at had a tendency, most of the time, actually, like every year I was there, this was the case. They would schedule into the math classes the cluster of students that were on IEPs. And I don't know how common this is at other school sites, that the majority of those kids get clustered into one classroom because then a couple of aides are in that classroom as well. Well-meaning, right? You've got more adults in the classroom with kids who might have specific needs. But then the school I was at also scheduled into that same classroom all the English learners. And so, but again, their rationale is there's more adults in that room, right? But now you've created a population in a classroom that is just ripe for our own bias. Like you've got 28 out of 30 kids or 25 out of 30 kids that are either identified as English learners or students with disabilities. And it's challenging for an adult at that point not to think they have to slow down. They have a bias towards what students with those labels can do. And I'm going to move a little bit slower. I'm going to challenge you a little bit less. And it just was a structure in our system that was very well-meaning and just a bad idea at the same time because of the way it worked out, right? And there are a lot of them there. A lot of them are really hard to identify because we see the well-meaning portion way faster than we see the potential problems. And then we justify why those problems, like, I can't do anything about that, right? I don't have enough support to put a maximum of, 5 students with disabilities into each class so that it's more manageable, like so that everybody gets a better education, that kind of thing. So, and as we think about attaching this to the learning acceleration and that we've been talking about for the whole day and tomorrow, I really think about the idea like priority content and this universal design for learning, because the activities we're about to do very much are open-ended for students to make sense of the mathematics themselves. And in order to, the reason why I focus there is if we can give kids an opportunity to make sense of mathematics, they can make sense of it in their primary language, they can make sense of it and start where they're at, and we can help to push them beyond and go well above our standards by doing this. But when we teach kind of to a middle, you know, or try to get everybody to know the exact same thing in the exact same amount of time, it's a recipe for failure and frustration for our students who need more time, which are not just our language learners. So here's our first little math activity for us to do together, which is coming at the perfect time because my throat hurts. Here is, has anybody ever been here before? To the Mayan ruins in Chichen Itza? It's like on my bucket list, and I want to go there. You've been there, Jen? I want so badly to go there. So what I want to do is we've got a context here that describes the pyramid, El Castillo, excuse me, in Chichen Itza. And it's some information down here at the bottom says a temple at the top of the pyramid is approximately 24 meters above ground. And there are 91 steps leading up to the temple. So what I'd like to give you is a couple of minutes, just maybe a minute, to chat with your neighbor. What mathematical questions could you ask about this situation? Anything at all that is mathematically inclined. And on Zoom, if you can type as many, in a minute and a half, as many mathematical questions as you can into the chat, we'll share some of them out in just a moment. All right. Anybody have mathematical questions they came up with? Any at all? No? Okay, the top of the temple. The temple itself. Okay. To the bottom of it. Okay, so how high off the ground is it? All right. Anybody else? How tall is each step in centimeters? All right. And I want to share, Jen shared some firsthand knowledge because she'd been there, that, and if I get this correct, not all of the steps are the same. So it's not a standardized step, like which would be interesting because now using something that is potentially more relevant to a class, if you know your class and the students in your class, you might have students who have been here and they are aware of that, right? Because the 91 steps, you could ask how tall is each step in centimeters or something like that. And a student's going to struggle with that being there if you don't unearth the fact that they're aware the steps aren't the same size. Right? I didn't know that until you shared it. So I think that was one of the questions I was thinking of is how tall is a single step? Did anybody online write anything out? Okay. What was the angle of the corner? All right. Okay. All right. That's awesome. The slope of the stairs and the steps? Okay. I had thought of one when I put this in here that I would not have thought of before, but my son is on a climbing team and his coach is like crazy athletic. Like, and so a couple of weeks ago we went to a trail in our area in Southern California where he was doing what is called an Everest challenge. And so it was a 6-mile trail up and back to the top of this peak and about a 900-foot elevation gain. And so in 24 hours, he ran the trail 39 times to equal traveling the height of Mount Everest. Okay, in 24 hours, continuously running this trail, right? I'm like, I got 2 minutes and 40 seconds of that and I'm done. But it made me think about this and how many times do I have to go up and down to complete an Everest challenge? You know, so that's what it made me think of, is how many times would I have to climb to the top of the temple and back down to reach the equivalent of the height of Mount Everest, right? Or the distance you travel from base camp of Everest to the peak. Right? And compare it to the stairs for Rocky, right? Something like that. But again, getting to this idea that we're not necessarily doing mathematics directly here, but we are thinking about things mathematically and where does math show up in the real world and how does our own experience relate to that? But this is a great way to bring in the assets your students bring to class, right? Which isn't necessarily going to be provided in a textbook, but super easy to find on the internet. Okay, so with the time we have left, we're going to get through as many of these as possible, but there are slides explaining all of them. And the 5 shifts we're going to look at today, or 5 things we could do to increase the amount of mathematical discourse for our English learners in our classrooms, are to this idea of making word problems less wordy, 3-read protocol, making word problems less numbery, using number lines, and clothing naked math problems. So we have I don't know how often this is referred to this way throughout the math community, but in our COE at Riverside, we often talk about teachers needing to present fewer naked math problems to their students, which means just problems without context, right? They need a story because stories help us make sense of the world, all right? And so even if we do present naked math problems to students like 36 divided by 9 written out, we still can put a story to that to help them understand it. Because for millennia, we've been making sense of our world through story. So here's the first idea, is as kids are presented with word problems, to try to show them methods to make those word problems less confusing, okay? I promise you at no point am I going to recommend something like cubes, if you're familiar with what that is. If you're not familiar with what cubes is, it's an acronym that stands for circle something, underline something else, put a box around something else, then do something with the E and the S. I think like mentally I've blocked out what the actual meaning is because I don't want to know. But again, this is one of those structures that is well-meaning because we want, and I'm pretty sure, I didn't use cubes, but I had many acronyms up on my wall in my math classroom when I was teaching that were meant to help students remember processes. But sadly, what happens is kids tend to just focus on whether or not they're doing the process right. They're not learning any math while they do it. And so the tricky part is, as I work with teachers now, I fully recognize that the hard part is cubes is something that's easy to assess and it's easy to see if kids are doing the steps. And it's easy to step in and say, don't forget you're supposed to underline the question. Don't forget you're supposed to box the numbers, right? It's an easy thing to intervene on when you see kids aren't doing it correctly, right? And you get way more false positives from that than you do from something like a 3-read protocol. And a 3-read protocol takes longer to get kids, it doesn't really take longer to get more positive outcomes out of kids, but it doesn't feel as concrete to us. And we're so used to like that more concrete data of who's above standard, who's below standard, and who do I need to intervene with in my small group and things like that. All right, so here we go. How does that problem look to you? I know you can't see it and read all the details, but just look at the overall, is there a feeling you have looking at that problem? What's that? Okay, it feels like there's like 90 steps, right? And so forth. So it's not like a kind of, anybody feel that way? Like a little like, I'm not sure. Like there's a lot there. So this is a cookies for bake sale volunteers problem. It comes from, I'm not actually sure the source, but it probably is maybe a Mars. It does kind of look like a Mars task, which means, and there's probably a lot that led up to this, right? But the reality is just looking at that, especially from the lens of a language learner, right? There's a lot of text there. There's some pictures I don't know about and things like that. So when we think about how we can adjust this, right? Maybe we strip away all the words to begin with, right? And we make it a little less wordy by just highlighting that picture and asking kids, what do you notice? So what do you notice about the picture? And if you're online, you can type things in the chat. We'll share those out too. Just call it out. Anything that you notice about the picture. They all have cookies. Okay. Anything else? Tell me more about that. There's 2 sets of equal groups. Okay, so on the left side, there's 36 in the groups, and the right side, there's 20. All right. Anything else you notice about it? What's that? Oh, so there's fewer groups of 36 and more groups of 20. Was there something online? Okay, there's 2 different size bags, and there are more bags of 20 and fewer bags of 36. Okay. So is there anything you wonder? Any questions? Okay, so you're kind of wondering how much is in each group because you know they're not equal. Okay. Isn't a 0? It doesn't give you a 0 in the ones place. So you're saying you know they're not equal, but at first you were kind of wondering if they were equal. Okay. Oh, so you're wondering how much you're going to pay for cookies. All right. All right. Any other wonderings? Oh, wonder what kind of cookies they are, right? Because if they're cookies I don't like, then it doesn't matter what I'm going to pay for them. Right? I'm not buying them. So are the boxes and bags the same price and what kind of cookies they are, right? Oh, so the actual, okay. Okay, so are the cookies in the bags and boxes the same size? Are they mini cookies? All right. Okay. So these are all some of those mathematical questions we could ask, right? As far as like what the size of the cookie is, how much they cost, are the amounts here equivalent? Things like that. So as we do this, we can start to ask more questions of kids so that they can make sense of the importance of the visual, right? Like things like how many cookies are represented or, and how did you think about that? So just take a moment and either with a neighbor, like you don't have to find the answer, but how would you go about figuring out how many cookies are represented there? What would your solution path be?
And then 12 multiplication of 36. On the average. 40.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's 36 times 8. 8, 4.
Okay. I don't know. Nuh-uh. Yep. Sounds about right. Okay, so what about solution pathways? How did you guys think about approaching it? Not an answer. Okay, so one pathway was to count up all the 2s and the 20s and add a 0 on the end. So 2, 4, 6, 8. Okay, and when we're adding that 0, we're multiplying by 10, right? Okay. So any other solution pathways? Okay. Okay. So every 5 of the 20s is 100. All right, with the friendly numbers that you know. Okay. It's not as friendly now. Okay. All right. Any other solution pathways? So you use partial products for 36, like breaking it into 30 and 6. Okay. And then you did, was it like the 8 times 30 and 8 times 6 and added it together? Okay. All right. Which makes them a little bit more friendly, right? Mm-hmm. Distributive property. Okay. That distributive piece. Okay. And then adding those two pieces together. Thank you, Michelle. Importantly here, one of the things again with all of our students, I really try to stay away from what I heard a lot as a teacher, which is what's good for English learners is good for all students, because I always felt like my colleagues and myself sometimes interpreted that as, oh, then what I'm doing is good for English learners. Like they flip it around as like, if I'm doing it for all, like it's almost like we hear the statement wrong, and focus in on like, oh, then what I'm doing for everybody must be good for them too, for English learners. Like, and so I don't like the phrase, but the reality is I'm intentionally, if I was with students, focused in on what was your solution pathway, far more than I'm interested in what your answer was. And to be honest, I didn't figure it out. You said, Abe, it was like 5 something, 524, 528, somewhere around there. Okay. And so there's another question here of like, how many more cookies are in 5 boxes than 5 bags? And so that's another mathematical question that requires comparison. And we're going deeper with reasoning instead of just computation. And that's kind of this underlying theme for today, is that we want to highlight reasoning instead of computation, right? Because I come back to this when I ask my son, hey, if you're looking at this, what's your solution strategy to figure out how many cookies there are? And as a snarky 7th grader, he tells me I'd ask Siri. Well, okay, that's a solution pathway. If all I'm interested in is the answer, that's a solution pathway, right? You know? And so it's legitimate, but then how would you think about it if you didn't have that tool? Because the thinking is what can then be applied to novel or non-unique, non-routine situations. That's why the thinking's so important. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Right. Because if you try to do this with a computer, a calculator, asking Siri, you're going to sit there and be like, well, Siri, what's 36 plus 36 plus 30? Like, or you're using some reasoning, what's 8 times 36 plus, what is that, 12? 12 times 20, right? So you're still using some mathematical reasoning to be able to articulate the question you want to ask, right? Which just further reinforces the idea that these tools are relevant in our classrooms, and they actually help us to highlight reasoning and get away from this focus on computation, right? Because the reality is, especially for our students who traditionally struggle in mathematics, they struggle because we tend to focus on there being one way to do math, and that the answer in the computation is what's necessary, right? And with teachers we work with so often, I'm like, we have to have a loftier goal for our students than just the right answer. because this thing on my wrist gives me the right answer. Right.
I looked back at the questions that was on the page and I was like, that's what we just
hmm
just understanding what's there, like the information was there first, like it didn't feel so hard.
Right. And so and you make a great point. Like everything we did was what was on the question, right? And it wasn't necessarily because of the way I walked us through it, you know, but because of the questions you asked and the noticings and the wonderings, we answered most, if not all, of these questions up here, right? And the key component, though, for our students that are multilingual, but also our students with disabilities and every other student in our class, is we can't stop here, right? A lot of times we stop here and just bring up another problem. Like, hey, and there was good mathematical conversation we had, right? There was good learning that would happen in that situation, but we can't stop there because our kids are going to see that on SBAC. They're not going to see this and be asked to notice and wonder, right? They're going to see this question on SBAC, and they're going to have to figure it out. Cubes, yeah.
Gaining their confidence and putting setting them up for actual understanding, but then like our state is giving us this.
Right.
They have to be.
Yeah. And so the question for everybody online is how do we get kids from this, the noticing, the wondering, and the conversation and the math that we did, to being prepared for that, right? Mackenzie?
Absolutely. Yeah, no problem. Something that's just surfacing for me is just the idea of the metacognitive strategies we're trying to instill in our kids. And so why can't okay, we've done this process. You have permission to do that process on your own, because what I've noticed is kids are not transferring because they don't think they can do that, say, on a test. So it's like, hey, on your Chromebook when you're taking that state test, like use your hands or zoom in and go through that process that we've been doing. Again, this is what I want you to do. So just focusing on that metacognition, that thinking about thinking. So yeah, what we did here, whole group, you could do internally. Just something that resonates with me.
Well, thank you, because that's exactly what I was going to say. There's actually a fairly decent body of research to show that we have to be explicit with students and point out, hey, we just did a bunch of math here, and what we actually did was we answered this. And here's where we answered it. And when you're given this, what I'm saying is it might be helpful for you to look at the diagrams first and make sense of those before you try to attack the words, right? But that's the key component of it that we sometimes miss in instruction, because we go from this to the next problem. Or we go from this and it was a warm-up and it was completely unrelated to the lesson, and the kids don't make those connections on their own. They have to make those connections and we have to be explicit with the way we make them for them. So we have to tell them all of that stuff we just did and go through and look, we answered the two teams with the bake sale, like bake the number of cookies filled in 8 boxes and 12 bags. How many cookies did the students bake? We may not have found the exact answer. Abe did. But, which I thank you for that. But we did get a solution pathway going, right, for everybody. And then how many more cookies are in 5 boxes than 5 bags, right? We also began to talk about that. But the key component is to bring this back up and make those connections explicit for the learners, and giving them permission. Like, we're going to do a lot of problems like this, not we today, but I would say this to students. We're going to do a lot of problems in this way so that you recognize this is a valid way to approach complex problems that you see in other situations. And it's that explicit teaching, that's what needs to be explicitly taught, is that we did a whole bunch of stuff here. What we actually did was answer to all of that by just simply focusing in on the image and asking some questions about it. So So that really is, we kind of answered that last question about what's the benefit of this. And there are tools that we can teach kids. There's like masking available and things like that as supports for students on our state tests. But it's also just a good practice to get kids to use those things. Not masking tools, but to get them to focus in on diagrams and things like that that are presented as a way of making sense of problems, right? And it's not that hard to prep that. You got a problem like this in your digital curriculum, I'm gonna snip that image out, plop it onto a slide deck, and ask the kids to notice and wonder, you know? And then maybe intentionally ask them some of these questions and show them like, hey, this is what we just did. All right. So if you type in the bit.ly that's here on the screen, it will take you to the true framework that I showed you earlier today, or earlier in the session. And I just want to give you about 2 minutes to think about the making word problems less wordy, and which one of the 5, and it doesn't have to be just one, but which one of the 5 dimensions of true do you feel is evident in the routine we just did? We'll come back together in about 2 minutes. And you can share with your neighbor. It doesn't have to be quiet. I think learning should be a community endeavor. All right. Maybe we can, if anybody, did anybody type anything online about which one? No big deal. That's all right. Anybody else kind of, anything jump out at you about which one of the true dimensions this might align to? No? Abe?
For Stacy and I, we both jumped on equitable access to mathematics and also agency, authority, and identity. I think they're both equal. It talks about inequitable access airtime. So not only are you removing the words, so it's more equitable for ELs, but you're letting anybody, we had a couple questions about like what kind of cookie, like how would they taste? Like you're going to get those kinds of responses from students that maybe aren't usually raising their hand to participate in math class, which is awesome. And then the agency, authority, identity, they are making the problem. So if they made the problem, they're more, it's like just like with a kid, like if they make dinner, they're more likely to eat it. Like if they're making a problem, they're more likely to care about solving it.
No, I love the way you put that, because I often think about the fact that how motivated are we really to answer a question someone else has asked, But if we ask our own question, like I asked it because I want to know the answer, right? But you're absolutely right. The opening it up, I'm glad you made the connection to agency, authority, and identity, because when we honor students, just simply letting the kid that is wondering what kind of cookies are in the bags, letting them voice that, increases their own agency within the classroom, because you've given them permission to realize like their contribution is a positive contribution, regardless of what that is, right? And it takes all of 3 seconds to allow that kid to ask that question. That's not necessarily mathematical, right? All right. we are not, with 8 minutes left, going to get through all 5 of these shifts, which I promise you that's the first thing I kept thinking as I developed this. I'm all 5 in an hour and a half, please. That's not going to happen. How many of you are familiar with the 3-read protocol? Okay. I think a lot of people are. It's been in our frameworks. It's been in our curriculum for about a decade now in a lot of different ways. But the idea behind a 3-read protocol, at least the way we do it, because it's sometimes done differently, that first read, we really want kids to be making sense of what's going on. So it's really, really important too, as we present word problems to students, and we talked about this earlier, that we make them relevant to the students in your class, right? Which means the problems that are relevant this year may not be relevant next year, right? There are certain things you can probably ask Google or ChatGPT or some other AI. You know, can you change this into a context that is meaningful to 4th graders? And you know, you might get something that's pretty close to being meaningful to 4th graders, but you also we need to get to know our students so that we know what's meaningful to them, right? But the idea behind a 3-read protocol and the way that we think about it is we really want students to make sense of the math, and through these 3 steps, we're going to ask kids on that first read, what's the story about, okay? The one thing I'll share about the 3-read protocol is it's not, at least not the way I've ever thought about it. Sometimes I'll work with teachers and they'll come back and like, I tried that, but it took like 45 minutes. I'm like, okay, like, but we need to get down to that, to like, down to like 6 or 8 minutes, you know? Because this first read, I'm going to make sense of it real quick. That's like 30, 45 seconds. I'm going to ask a few kids what's going on, make sure they understand the context of what it is. That second read, they're going to identify the quantities in the story and the relationships. This is huge because it's the way you combat kids being number grabbers, where they're like, okay, we've been talking about multiplication for the last 2 weeks. You gave me a word problem. I'm grabbing those numbers and I'm multiplying, right? The other way you combat that is when you present content to kids, we have to vary the operation. That if you're in the multiplication unit, it doesn't mean you can't do problems with addition and subtraction, right? And if you want kids to pay attention to what's going on, you can't make it obvious what the operation is, what you're going to be asking them to do. It's also a great way to review. And then finally, sometimes the third read is just what's the question, let's answer it. But oftentimes, to make it more engaging and open-ended for all of our students, we go back to this idea of mathematical questions, and we like to remove the question from the STEM and ask kids first, what mathematical questions could you ask about this? And I personally love that because one of the things it does is it gets kids to realize, without me nagging them, that the question's important. Because if I could ask a bunch of questions about one situation, then I sure as heck better read that question and make sure I'm answering it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely. And really, I'm going to skip through a little bit of this because that was the next shift and you can definitely combine those 2 things depending on what you're seeing as the struggle with your own students. But exactly that, removing the numbers. So like this is the situation without any numbers. We're collecting some money from a recycling, from a candy sale and some more money from recycling. Then we introduce some numbers. The next time we read it, we introduce another number and ask kids how it changed, and then so on. And eventually we present them with the question. And it teaches kids over time. It's never going to be a magic, I've done this once and now kids are going to be great at word problems. Over time, they get better at recognizing the importance of the nuance in the language and what's being presented. So with that, there are a couple of other routines in here, but we are just about done. And I wanted to say, like, what I would hope you would take away from today is the importance of context with English learners. I think oftentimes in our system, we shy away from word problems with our language learners because we're like, well, they can't read the language, right? But that just means we shouldn't give them to them and leave them on their own to figure it out, right? But one of the ways you can't learn a language without being immersed in it in every way, speaking, listening, reading, writing, right? Which means we can't shy away from word problems just because students may not be able to tackle them by themselves. There's all kinds of structures we can put in place in a community learning environment that can help kids learn the language at the same time as learning the math, right? But continually providing them with naked math problems is not going to solve the problem, okay? So you do have the rest of the slide deck, and there's going to be feedback, I believe, in the app. So I'll be hanging around for a few minutes if any of you want to ask questions. If you do have some final questions on Zoom, please drop them in the chat, and I'll answer those before I leave. So thank you all for being here.